Welcome back, guys. All right, so today we are finally going to start the American Revolution. We're going to look at the early years. We're going to look at the early years. You're going to do this in the form of a foldable 3 flaps. Looks like this. It says the early years across the top. And we're going to look at 3 early year battles. The battle in New York, Trenton, and Saratoga. These are the 3 battles that we are going to look at. And so your foldable should look something like this. The early years at the top, and then the 3 places, New York, Trenton, Saratoga, going across the bottom. Now, we're looking at these 3 because they all had very important outcomes. Very important lessons learned in each one. And so what we're going to do first is the first battle we are going to look at is in New York. So flip up the foldable, flip up the tab for New York, and this is where you're going to take those notes. And so the first thing that we're going to understand is that this takes place in August of 1776. August of 1776, we're in New York. And what happens is you have the Navy and the Army of Great Britain. You have the Navy and the Army of Great Britain. This is just poorly drawn, but you'll get the point. So you have the Navy and the Army of Great Britain, and these guys are on their way to New York. Now, we discussed in our previous video that one of the weaknesses of the Continental Army is that they do not have a navy. And so really the Navy is carrying the Army soldiers on those naval ships anyway, and they are able to come right to New York. And so what it ends up being is the kickoff to the American Revolution. And it is Britain versus the colonies. Britain versus the colonies. And it is essentially three soldiers for Britain versus every 1 soldier from the colonies. But the war progresses, and this battle is fought. And what ends up happening is the colonies have a death toll of 1,400. 1,400. And so you would keep writing down. I just don't have the space. What ends up happening is the leader, man with the curly white wig, George Washington, says, "Let's go. It is time to give up in New York." And so Washington, after saying "let's go," takes his troops to Pennsylvania. And they go to Pennsylvania in order to recuperate. And so what happens is by doing this, the colonial army escapes. The colonial army escapes. They get away. And this becomes the importance of the battle in New York is it proves that Britain they're stronger. They are physically bigger and stronger. Britain is bigger and stronger than the colonies are. But despite that, the weakness of the British leadership is weak and because they allow the colonial army to escape. So they're stronger in numbers, but they were weaker in decision making. In fact, the Battle of New York and allowing the colonial army to escape did not end the war. Had the British not allowed the colonial army to escape back into Pennsylvania, that would have ended the war right there. And so the strength and numbers lie with Great Britain, and the Battle of New York proves that. Because again, it's about 3-1 once you combine their army and navy versus the Continental Army. And that results in, right there off the bat, 1,400 deaths for the colonial army. And that's because they're able to just travel straight into New York. Washington realizes we got to go, travels to Pennsylvania where they're able to escape. Allowing them to get away is a terrible decision by the British because it doesn't end the war right there. Had they not allowed them to escape, war would have been over very quickly. Battle number 1, right off the bat. Gone. See you later. But they are allowed to escape. That brings us to our second flap. Our second flap is Trenton. Our second flap is Trenton. And so what we need to recognize before we talk about Trenton. So again, that middle flap now, fold that up, take your notes. Is that from August of 1776, which is when the Battle of New York was, so from August to December of 1776, you have Great Britain, that's the British flag, and all they're doing is they're handing out L's to the colonies. Nothing but L's. Every battle, loss, 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 loss. Just handing out L's to the colonies over and over and over again. And so December of 1776, Washington realizes something's got to change. Something's got to change. And he comes to a river. And that is the Delaware River. They're at the Delaware River. And you have, on this side, you have the colonies. Led by Mr. George Washington. And on this side, you have a group known as the Hessians. You got a group called the Hessians. And this goes back to what we were talking about in the previous video. The strength of the colonial army is that they're excited and want to fight. They want freedom and independence. And so they're fighting because they want their freedom. And so they want freedom. The Hessians are paid mercenaries. They are paid by the British to fight in this war. They're actually German. So the outcome of this war doesn't necessarily affect them back home. And so they are simply fighting for money. And again, it is that lack of pride at Trenton that allows the colonial army in the middle of the night to cross the Delaware River. This is while these guys are sleeping. So they're sleeping. They're out in dreamland sleeping. So in the middle of the night, led by George Washington, they cross the Delaware River over into Hessian territory. And when they get there, they capture weapons, ammo, supplies, food, water, all things you need. The only food that I know how to draw real good is a carrot. And that's not even drawn well. But supplies, you get the point. And they do this with a death toll of 0. No deaths. And so they capture all of these supplies and nobody dies. And they bring it back across to the colonies. And so all of a sudden, all of the ammunition that they need, all of the food and water and the stuff that they need to resupply is brought back without anybody dying. No one dies in this process. And so this is a major win for Washington. A major W for George Washington. He's able to win a battle without anybody dying, almost unheard of. And so the importance of Trenton the importance at Trenton is that colonists that are on the American side all of a sudden start to think different. This starts to make them believe we can win. Because prior to that, again, the constant losing had lost some colonial support. And so morale improves. People start believing that they can win. And so the belief that they can win leads to people enlisting for their army. All of a sudden, these people want to fight. And they want to sign up to be in the Continental Army. And so all of a sudden, they're winning in the recruitment of the neutral group. Remember, we talked in our previous video that the goal was to attract those that were neutral in the war, because one of us were going to fight with Great Britain if they had to. Patriots were going to fight with the Continental Army if they had to. And so it was that group that was neutral that you needed to get on your side. And so the battle at Trenton allows them to do that. Lastly, we are going to look at our third flap. That being Saratoga, the battle at Saratoga. And so in 1777, this war has already gone on longer than the British had believed that it would. So in 1777, the British come up with an idea. In 1777, the British decide to off the North. Cut off the North from everybody else. Because they believe that if they cut off the northern people, that the loyalists to Great Britain would eventually be able to wear down the middle and the southern colonies, which would lead to the surrender of the colonies as a whole. And so that brings us to Saratoga. That brings us to Saratoga. And Saratoga, again, this time is once again the British versus the colonies. And the general for the British is Burgoyne versus Gates. Horatio Gates for the Americans. And so they fight and they battle and they fight. And ultimately what ends up happening, what Gates is able to force Burgoyne to do in October of 1776, he is forced to surrender. And this is a major victory. A major, huge victory. I'm sorry, in October of 77, not 76. This is a huge and a major victory for the colonies because, oh my gosh, we just defeated the British in a major battle. Remember, the last big one wasn't the British Army, it was the Hessians. But they didn't necessarily care because it wasn't going to affect them back home. But this one is against the British, against one of their major generals. And it stops the brand new plan put together by the British, which was to cut off the northern colonies from everybody else. And so the importance of this again is twofold. One, remember the plan of the British was to take the colonies and divide them. If you could divide the colonies, you could depend on the loyalists to win the war for you, specifically in the middle colonies and in the south. But the opportunity to divide the colonies fails because he loses. The battle at Saratoga is lost. So that's importance number one. Importance number two isn't necessarily what happens at Saratoga, but what's happening while they're fighting. Because meanwhile, we got Benjamin Franklin, the man with the bifocals and the long hair. And he is speaking. He's talking, and he's asking for help. But he's not asking just anybody for help and assistance. He's actually in Europe, talking to European countries. He's talking to Spain. And he's talking to France. And Spain and France have rivalries with Great Britain. And so they don't want Great Britain to win the American Revolution. It actually knocks them down a peg if they lose the American Revolution. And so when Spain and France hear that the colonies were able to win at Saratoga, they decide we're in it. And this is a major turning point for the colonies. The Battle of Saratoga is the turning point in the war because this right here eliminates Great Britain's advantage, which was numbers and a professionally trained army. This is the turning point of the war because it gets rid of the British advantage, the main British advantage. And now, I will say this. It's also ironic. It is also very ironic. The French decide to get involved in the American Revolution. This is the turning point of the war. It's one of the things that allows the colonies to ultimately win the American Revolution. But had France said no, one could, even if Spain says yes, one could argue that the colonies never win the American Revolution. Well, one of the reasons the French Revolution takes place is that the American Revolution is successful. And one of the reasons it's successful is because France got involved. So one could argue that if France had just minded their business, maybe the colonies don't win. Maybe this isn't America. Maybe we're living in Great Britain, West. Who knows? I don't. But you could argue. You could argue it. We're going to stop right here. We're going to stop right here in the early years of the war. We're going to stop at the major turning point. Going forward, you're going to see why this is a major turning point. You're going to see how all of a sudden the subsequent battles start to change. The advantage that the British had when they were handing out L's throughout 1776 seems to go away. And you're going to see why, again, this isn't just West England. This is America, because we win this Revolutionary War. And we're going to discuss why that is. We're going to discuss some major people. We're going to discuss the role of women, the role of African Americans in this war. A lot of things that aren't really talked about in history textbooks. We're going to delve and dive and look and research into that as we move forward. But you have an assignment on Canvas right now. So be sure you go do that. Reach out to me if you have any questions. There's multiple ways to get in touch with me, because I'm always willing to help. So if you need it, reach out. Let me know. As always, have a great day.